So now that we've folded our fabric in half, we're placing our pattern down on the fabric, pinning it to cut around the fabric. You're going to cut out, for your main piece of fabric, you're going to cut 2 pieces. You're going to have 2 pieces for your lining fabric. You're going to have 1 piece for batting and 1 piece of felt. So what I'm doing with mine is that I'm taking my main fabric and I'm also using it for the inside lining of my bag. Now you might have went out and got your lining, which that's good too, because usually I would use a duck cloth fabric, and you can get it at any local fabric store. And the duck cloth is a cotton fabric and it's great for linings, and that's awesome. You can use that. But if not, you can use your main fabric for the inside lining as well. Now we're going to have 2 pieces of fabric for our inside lining. We're going to have a piece of fabric for the main part of our bag with our batting. That's the main part, the front part of our bag and batting. And we're going to also have a piece for our back bag, and that's where our felt is going to go. Now we're getting ready to create our inside pocket. You're going to place your pattern piece on the fold of the fabric as shown here. You're going to pin it down and you're going to cut it out. Now this is the duck cloth fabric that I told you about. It's a canvas fabric, a cloth fabric that you could actually get at any of your local fabric stores, and you could use it for inside lining or pockets like we're doing now. You can create actually a whole bag out of it. So now we're going to pin it down and we're going to cut the pattern piece out. Once you cut it out, you can actually use this size for your pocket, or I'm going to show you another way to fold this particular piece of fabric to create a longer pocket. And I'm going to also show you how to create a pocket without your pattern piece. So once you cut it out, like I said, you can actually, once you trim around, not cutting the fold of a fabric, you can create the pocket the size that it is now, or I'm going to show you another way to create it. So now you can stitch and leave a bottom to actually fold it inside out, or you can turn the pocket, stitch the sides and the bottom, leaving a opening to fold it inside out. And you actually do that for all your pockets. So now I'm getting ready to show you how to create a pocket without using your pattern, because you might want a bigger pocket. So I wanted a larger pocket, so I decided to create a pocket without a pattern. I want to show you how to do that, because you might want to create a different pocket. So now what I'm looking for is a 5.5 on the fold. I'm placing my fabric, I'm measuring it for 5.5 on the fold. So once I find my 5.5 mark, as shown, I'm then going to take my measuring tape and I'm going to measure across 13.5 inches, because that's how long I want my pocket to be. And then after I find my 13.5 inches, because that's how long I want my pocket to be, and that's also with my seam allowance, I'm going to mark my 13.5. And then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to draw a straight line. So just follow as shown. And then I'm going to cut that pocket out. And once I cut the pocket out, which I've cut it out actually already, you'll see in a minute, you're going to have a piece of fabric that's going to look like this. And now I'm going to take you over to the sewing machine and I'm going to show you how to stitch it up. So we're going to stitch each side, and at the bottom leaving an opening to turn it inside out. Okay, see you at the next lesson. Okay, now we're getting ready to sew our pocket. We've pinned it, and remember we left an opening at the bottom to turn it inside out. When you first start stitching your pocket, remember to stitch and then back stitch. You stitch forward a couple and then you stitch back a couple. That's locking in a stitch. Remember not to sew over your pins, and we're sewing about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance here. and then back stitch at the end. So now we're getting ready to repeat the same step on the other side as shown. Do not sew over your pins. And we're sewing about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Remember to back stitch. Okay, now we're getting ready to trim our pocket, trim off the extra fabric. Remember not to cut your seams, but just trim off the fabric as shown here. And that, you know, it won't be so bulky when you turn it out. Turn it inside out, rather. So now we're getting ready to turn it inside out. And once we turn it inside out, we're going to, that bottom that we left open, we're going to fold it in, we're going to pin it, and we're going to press it. Remember, pinning and pressing makes it look professional. So we're going to push out all the corners of the pocket as we turn it inside out, as shown here. It takes a minute sometime, but it's okay. That's because this is a really thick fabric too. It's a really nice, it's because it's a canvas. It's really nice. So now, okay, now that we've done that, we pushed it out. Now we're, tucking in the bottom piece that we have open, and we're going to take this to the iron, and we're going to press it. Now that we're back and we've pressed it, we're going to take the inside lining, the inside of our bag, and we're going to place the pocket on the inside of our lining. So what we're going to do to find the middle, we're going to take our fabric and we're going to fold it in half as shown. And this will help us find the middle of our fabric for the placement of our pocket. Now we're going to take our pocket piece and we're going to fold it in half, finding the center as shown, and we're going to place it on the center of the fabric. And then we're going to come down, we're going to measure down about 3.5 inches. It depends on the placement that you would like your pocket, but for this video, I measured down about 3.5. And now we're going to pin this pocket on, and we're going to take it to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch around. And we're going to stitch a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the pocket, remembering to not stitch the top of the pocket because that's where our stuff goes. And then on the fold of our pocket, once we stitch it around, we're going to stitch it in the middle to create 2 pockets. And you'll see that in a minute. So now we're going to get ready to take it over to our sewing machine and stitch. So remember, our seam allowance here is about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're going to back stitch in the beginning, and we're going to stitch all the way around. Remember, do not stitch over your pins. Now we're stitching the bottom of our pocket. Removing a pin so we won't stitch over it, and continuing across the bottom of our pocket. And you're going to back stitch at the end. Okay. Now where the fold is in the middle, we're going to take it and we're going to stitch that middle. Just put your needle right on that fold Starting at the top, you're going to back stitch, and that's going to create 2 nice size pockets. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson. Now we're getting ready to create our loops for our handles. You need 4 loops for your handles. So these are our store-bought handles. So now you get to choose your fabric. I could use the duck cloth that I used for the pocket, but now I decided to actually use the fabric that I use for the entire bag. So now you're going to take the fabric and you're going to place it on a fold. This is going to help you create 4 loops. On the fold, you're going to pin it down and you're going to create your first 2 loops. And then after you cut those out, you're going to pin it down on the fold again. You're going to repeat the process and you're going to actually create the other 2 loops, creating 4 loops for your handles. So just watch as shown. Then the next step, after we cut out our loops for our handles, I'm going to show you how to fold the loops so you can create the loops to put inside of the handles. And now we're cutting out the first 2 loops, first 2 pieces of fabric for our loop. And you're going to take that same pattern piece and you're going to put it on the fold and repeat the process. And you're going to create 2 more loops. Now we will have 4 pieces of fabric to create our loops. So here we're going to take 1 piece of fabric and I'm going to show you how to fold. You're going to fold it in half as shown, and then you're going to take one side and fold it to the middle as shown, and you're going to repeat that on the opposite side. And then after that, you're going to fold it in half and you're going to pin it, and you're going to repeat this process to the other 3 remaining pieces of fabric. You could also press them as well, and that'll help keep it down as well. But always pin and press makes it look professional. So now we're taking them over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch down the middle of each loop. You always, when you start stitching, you always start at the beginning, and by stitching backwards, you go forward twice and stitch backwards twice. And then you repeat that process at the end of your strap, or loop rather. So now what you're going to do is repeat this process to the remaining 3 pieces of fabric. And we stitch it right down the middle, or close to it. So now you're going to repeat this step, forward, backward stitch. The backward stitch locks it in. You're going to go to the bottom of your loop, you're going to back stitch, and you're going to repeat this process to the remaining pieces of fabric. The next step I'm going to show you is how to actually put these loops on your handle, and we're going to use a little bit of fabric glue to actually keep them in place. And the fabric glue actually, while we're getting ready to prepare our bag to place the handles on, by that time the fabric glue will be dry, and it just helps it stay in place. So now that you have your 4 loops, just cut off the excess thread extra pieces of thread that might be lingering over it. And now we're going to place them on our handles. So you take your handles, you put the fabric through the loop. So the first process, what I did, I pinned just to get all of the pieces on both handles. And then I'm going to show you that we're going to take a little bit of fabric glue so we can get rid of the pins. It'll be easier, excuse me, placing your handles on your bag with the pins not there. So now we're finished. So now I'll see you in the next lesson, and I'm going to show you, well, after we put our glue on. So we're going to put our glue on, okay, just as shown here. Just follow those steps. And then I'll see you in the next lesson. And we're going to put our handles on our bag. Placing our handles. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Now we're getting ready to place our handles on our bag. So this is my front of my bag. So I'm placing this at 6 1/8 of an inch from the sides, from both sides. What you want to do is make sure your handle placement is evenly placed in the middle from each side of your bag. So once you do that, you're going to pin it down. Now this is the first part. This is the front part of my bag. You're going to make sure that your handle, the round part, is facing down. That's like right sides together to the fabric. And the flat side is up towards you, if you have these handles. Now we're going to take our lining. Now this is our back piece of our bag, okay? Remember, that's our batting for the back piece of the bag. This is a back piece of the bag. So now we're getting ready to place our handles. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to place our handles right sides together, our handle to our fabric, and we're going to measure 6 1/8. If you're doing this size bag, you could have created a larger bag or a smaller bag, but you make sure that your handles are actually measured from the same side evenly in the middle of your bag, and then you pin. So you want the same amount of fabric on each side from the right to the left side of the bag, measuring into your handles. So with this particular bag and its measurements, and if you're using this pattern, of course, then you use 6 1/8 inch as shown. You pin your handle down, and the next step is actually adding our lining to our bags. So now, this is the back piece of fabric. This is the back of our bag. Remember that. So our batting is not pinned all the way down, so you would pin everything because we're going to stitch across. But what we're going to do is we're going to add our lining piece of fabric. Now, because this is the back of the bag, you're going to use the piece of lining that has your pocket on there. So we're going to turn right sides of fabric together, right sides to right sides. And we're going to pin across because we're going to take this to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch about a 1/16 of an inch from the top of our fabric. And that's the only place we're going to stitch is the top of this bag, because we're going to stitch not only the lining, but we're going to stitch the handle down as well. The handle fabric loops. Just make sure I get that, straight and clear with you. That's all. This is actually going to be a very fun bag Just take your time with it. No one's in a rush. No one's competing in a race. So you can create beautiful tote bags. And I think you're going to actually like this, and you'll be able to reuse that pattern and create more. And the more you create, the better you get at it. So now what we're doing is pinning the top. We're pinning everything down, all layers of fabric together, and we're going to do the same thing to the front part of our bag. We're going to place the lining on the front part of our bag as well, and we're going to stitch the top about 1/16 of an inch from the top. And again, if you need the measurements, we actually have it on our website. You can download it for free, and it'll just kind of help you through measuring the different measurements, and it'll just guide you through. I needed it too, so it's okay. It's okay. So now we're going to repeat that process to the front part of our bag. Right sides of fabric together, and we're going to pin it at the top. And once we've pinned everything together, we're going to take it to our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch a 1/16 inch from the top. And you notice I'm really putting the pins in because you want this to actually, you know, be put together, pinned together really well, because you don't want your fabric to move, because we're actually creating like a small seam allowance. So now we're going to stitch both pieces at the top. Now we're at the sewing machine, and now we have all the layers pinned together. Now remember, we're not going to sew through our pins. Remember to take your pins out. But we're getting ready to stitch about a 1/16 inch. Remember to always go forward and then back stitch. So you go forward twice and then back stitch twice. And as I do this, you're going to see that I'm going to take my pins out because you don't want to sew over your pins. Remember to remove your pins. Take your time. No one is in a race because you want a nice bag. And you want to make sure that you actually sew all the layers of the bag, including your handle loops. You want to make sure that you sew your handle loops. So I'm going to let you watch this part of the video, and I will actually see you in the next lesson. So I'm going to give you a little music here, okay? So now we're getting ready to put our front and our back piece of our bag together. So now you have two pieces after you have actually added on your handles. Now this is our back piece of our bag with the pocket on there, pocket lining, and this is the front piece of our bag. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take our bag, we're going to open it up. Now this is the front of our bag with the lining. You're going to place your handles towards the front part of the bag. That's the front that I quilted. You're going to repeat that process with the back, and you're going to put right sides of fabric to right sides. And both of the handles are going to go towards the front of the bag, as shown here. Now, what's really important is that we're going to line up those lines right there, the seams. Let's line those up and pin. So line them up on top of each other and pin. You're going to do the same thing to the other side, seam to seam, and we're going to pin it. Next, what we're getting ready to do is actually pin around the entire bag, and we're going to leave the bottom of the bag open. We're only going to stitch in on each side of the bottom of the bag 2 inches in, because we want to leave an opening to turn the bag inside out and to also get our handles out. So just watch as shown. We're going to mark 2 inches in on one side of the bottom of the bag, and we're going to mark 2 inches in on the other side, and that's where we're going to stitch in the bag. We're going to leave that open at the bottom to get our handles in, because our handles actually measured about 7.5 inches, so we'll have a 9-inch opening at the bottom. So now what we're getting ready to do is pin around the entire bag. We're going to put 2 pins at the bottom where we're going to stop our stitching at. Now remember, our handles are facing the front part of our bag. The linings are lined up together, and the right sides of the fabric is together, right sides to right sides. So now let's pin all the way around. We've already actually matched up our seams on our bag already. So now we're just stitching around. So we're only stitching where we're actually placing our pins. We are not stitching the square bottom of our bags, because what we're going to do with that is that'll be in the next step. So after we pin our bag all the way around, we're going to pin right there where we're going to stop our stitching. We're going to take this bag to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch it all the way around, and then then all the way around, leaving that opening at the bottom. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson. Okay, now we're getting ready to stitch around our bag. We're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and remember, you're going to back stitch at the beginning and also at the end. So this is at the bottom of our bag, and we're going to stitch all the way around using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now sometimes I use a sewing gauge just to put under there to make sure my needle, I'm at a 1/2 inch. You can use that, or you can just whatever seam allowance you like to use, it's up to you. So now we've just sewn that one. Now we're getting ready to sew the side of the bag. I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but you can use whatever seam allowance you like, whatever you prefer. So I use my seam gauge or sewing gauge, and I put it under there just to see where the needle is at a 1/2 inch. And then once you get it actually lined up, then you can follow the lines on your sewing machine as well. So you always, when we stitch, we back stitch, remove any pins so you don't sew over the pins, and we stitch all the way down the bag, all the way across the bag. So now we're on one of the sides of the bag. I'm going to stitch all the way. All the way, we're going to stitch over the line that we lined up, remember? And we're going to now, this is our lining that we're stitching. And we just stitch a straight line using a 1/2 inch seam allowance or whatever seam allowance you prefer. We get to the bottom, we back stitch. Now we're going to turn it around. Now we're going to do the 2 inches that we marked on the bottom of the lining. Still a 2-inch seam allowance or whatever you prefer, and you're going to repeat this step on the other side of the bottom of the lining because that's where we're going to turn our bag inside out. So now we're going to actually start working on the side of our bag. The other side, we're going to stitch a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're going to stitch all the way down. We start out, remember, with our back stitch. We stitch down and we back stitch, removing all pins so we don't sew over the pins. And you sew all the way down the bag until you reach the bottom of the bag and you back stitch. Now we've sewed all the way around the bag, leaving the 2-inch, well, leaving the 9-inch opening at the bottom of the bag to turn it inside out. Now we're getting ready to trim off all the extra fabric around our bag, as shown. You can see where we did sew the 2-inch seam allowance, and we're going to stitch around there, and we still have our opening at the bottom of our lining where we sewed in 2 inches on both sides, leaving the opening. So now we're going to trim around, trimming all the extra fabric off because you don't want that bulk in your bag. Trust me, you don't want it. So that's why we trim close to your seam allowance, not cutting your seams. Do not cut your seams because you'll have to stitch all over again if you do. So we're trimming all of that extra off. Now when we get to the bottom of the bag where the lining is, we're going to only trim off where we stitched at. We're not going to trim off where the opening is. We're going to only cut the right, see, as I just did. Okay. Now see, we still have that bottom open so we can turn the bag inside out. Now we're getting ready to prepare our box seams. You line up seam to seam, side seam to bottom seam, just as you see me doing here. And you're going to pin it, and you're going to make sure the seams line up. You're going to pin. And you're going to do that to all 4 corners of the bag, as shown here. Open it up, match seam to seam, side seam to bottom seam, and you're going to pin. What I was doing there was opening up the seam so I could match them together and pin them seam to seam. And we're going to do that all the way around the bag. And pinning. Same here. Going to match seam to seam. Now, if you have a little extra fabric there, it's okay. You can actually trim it off, or you can wait till you stitch, but if it's bothering you, just go ahead and trim it off. Make it even when you line up the seams. Seam to seam. Pin, and then after we are finished pinning all 4 corners, we're going to actually take our seam gauge or ruler and we're going to mark in a 1/2 inch to actually stitch across the line, and you'll see. We'll get to that. Seam to seam and pin. Now we're getting ready to mark where we're going to actually stitch our line across, creating that box. So now we're getting ready to measure in. So we're measuring in. I measured in a 1/2 inch. And so you mark it on each side and then you draw your line. And you're going to repeat that process around the whole entire bag on all 4 corners, as shown here. Now, if you wanted to mark in a little more, an inch, you could go in an inch. It's up to you. But I created a 1/2 inch here. 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you're going to repeat this process around the entire bag. And then after that, we're going to stitch those 4 corners together, following the lines, stitching on the lines that we just created. So now we're getting ready to actually take this to our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch across each line. So now we're getting ready to stitch across the line as shown here, making sure your seams are still lined up, side seam and bottom seam. You're going to put your bag under the sewing machine needle, and you're going to put that needle right on the line that we created, and you're going to stitch across. Back stitch, make sure you back stitch and stitch across, removing all your pins, making sure you're not sewing over any of your pins. And you're going to repeat this to all 4 sides of the bag as shown. All we're doing is putting the needle right on the line that we drew, making sure that we do not sew over our pins, and we're just stitching right across as seen. Now once we're finished sewing all 4 of our sides together, what we're going to do next is actually trim off the extra fabric like we do always, making sure that you do not cut your seam. Now we're getting ready to trim all 4 corners of our fabric, cutting close to the seams. Remember not to cut your seams, because then you would have to actually sew it all back up again. So just be careful. So now you're going to do that to all 4 corners. You're trimming off the fabric close to the seam, but you're not cutting the seam. So after we finish with this, we're going to go inside through the bottom of the lining where we left the bag open, and we're going to start to turn our bag inside out. When you start turning it inside out, you're just going to grab it like this, going inside out. You're going to pull your handles out, and that's why we made such a large opening at the bottom of our bag, because we wanted to make sure that we have room enough to pull out our handles. Now you're going to push the entire bag out. So now you see how your bag is forming. You're going to create some gorgeous bags. You're going to really like this, and just think you can create one for any outfit or travel or whatever you want to do. So now we're pushing out all the corners. That's the main bag. Now we're pushing out the corners for the lining. And so once you pushed out the corners for the lining, we're going to close up the bottom of the lining, folding it in, and we can either stitch the bottom or we can use fabric glue to close it up. Now we're getting ready to close up the seam on our lining. Usually you can stitch this on your sewing machine, but I want to show you other options as well, and it actually gives you a great finish look, and it's really durable, and we're going to use fabric glue. So just apply the fabric glue like I'm doing here. You don't have to put a lot. And then you're going to take your finger or something, whatever. You can use a brush, a paintbrush, a small paintbrush, whatever you want. But I just use my finger. And it's on the fold. Remember when we folded the both ends in at the bottom. So you're going to just, on the first fold, and you're going to just spread it over. It actually helps it to dry quicker as well. So just spread it on there, making sure. And you're only on that fold. Then you're going to take the other top fold and you're going to press it down to seal it. And let me tell you, it's a durable hold. Fabric glue is great for you can actually do no-sew projects with fabric glue. So just repeat the steps that I'm doing here as shown. And now we're getting ready to actually push our lining inside of our bag. Now again, you can actually take this to the sewing machine if you like, and you can stitch right across the bottom. That's fine. So now we're going to push the lining inside of the bag. You're really going to love these bags. I mean, come on, you just made your own tote bag. It's so cute and so adorable, and you can make so many more. You can actually sell them, make them and sell them. So now that we've put the fabric in, we push the lining inside the bag. Clean all the necessary strings off, or anything that you have that you need to actually clean up. Now we're getting ready to top stitch the top of our bag. We're going to top stitch all the way around. Now we're at the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch. We're going to push that bottom handle up under the bag, and then we're just as shown here, do exactly what I'm doing. And you want to make sure that you stitch over the handle loops as well. Just take your time. No one's in a rush, and this is not a race. Always back stitch when you start, and you can actually guide your bag. Just take your time. We're going to stitch it all the way around. You might have to help guide it, which is okay. You want to stitch over the loop as shown. Now to actually put your bag under the sewing machine, most sewing machines you could actually take a piece off in the front, and you can take it off and you'll be able to use that arm to place your bag up under the sewing machine. So just take your time. No one's in a race and we're not in a hurry. Stitch around the top part, stitching over the loops as shown here. You're almost finished with your bag. Yes. You're going to really enjoy this tote bag, and everybody's going to ask you, where did you get that? And remember, you're going to say, I made it. And they're going to say, can you make me one? And there's the start of a business. It's great. So you'll be designing, sewing, keeping it, selling it, or gifting it. But enjoy your tote bag. And there you have it. Enjoy.